Bore da, croeso chi gyd. Good morning, very warm welcome from a beautifully sunny Cardiff. My name is Richard Wyn-Jones. I'm Director of the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University, and we're hosting the event today and working in collaboration with our colleagues in the Scottish election study. We've got so much that we want to try to pack in to the event, so I am going to keep the introductions very, very brief. I want to say thank you, first of all, to the Scottish team for their collaboration. We've been working really closely together, and it's just a real pleasure. I want to thank you for your interest, but above all, I need to thank the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, who've kindly funded the research that makes today's session possible. And we've been very fortunate in cooperating with them during a period where it's been really difficult in terms of organising review processes, etc. So we're really grateful to them. In terms of the format for this morning, we're going to invite our Scottish colleagues to go first. And I'll allow Ailsa Henderson, my friend and colleague, who's the PI on the Scottish bid, to introduce them. Then we're going to go to Wales. Then we're going to do a Q&A session that potentially encompasses both presentations, or you're very welcome to ask questions about particular bits of particular presentations. I should also say, finally, before handing over to Ailsa, that this is the first of many events that we'll be doing. We've literally only just received the post-election data back. We got ours late on Friday afternoon. We finished our presentation at 11 o'clock last night. So and there's still stuff that we haven't looked at. Maybe the Scots have been more efficient than us, but there's a lot of data there. So we're just beginning. This is hopefully an interesting, illuminating taster of what we'll have to say in future events, but it is only the first foray with it. With that, I am going to turn off my camera and hand over to Ailsa. Ailsa, take it away.
Thanks very much for that, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking about this today. It's slightly strange to be speaking with Richard, but not about England. But this is even better. So I am principal investigator for the Scottish election study, and I am here with many of my colleagues. Fraser, McMillan, and Rob Johns will speak after me about the Scottish results. But obviously, Jack Larner is also part of the Scottish election study team, although today he'll be speaking in his capacity on the Welsh election study. I've only got 5 minutes, although I'm going to claim an extra minute to talk about the results at the front end. So in terms of the results, we thought it'd be helpful just to remind the audience what they were. We've got columns for votes and seats for both the constituency and the regional lists. And in terms of stability, I think it's probably best to look at the vote shares rather than the seat shares initially. And there you can see that the most polled election since devolution began in Scotland resulted in all parties within 1% of where they were last time on the constituency vote, the three largest parties within 1% of where they were last time on the list vote. Double the change for the Greens, a whopping 2% increase in support for the Greens, and obviously a 2% increase for the new entrant Alban. So that's just +2 from nothing before. The distribution of support across Scotland meant that there was a slightly larger change in terms of the seats, but in terms of electoral volatility across the system as a whole, there wasn't really an awful lot of it. But that aggregate stability masks a certain amount of individual level churn underneath. And that's why we've divided the presentation into 3. So I'll be talking about why people still want to vote for the SNP. Then Rob is going to be talking about what's going on in terms of support for the pro-union parties. And Fraser's going to be talking about what all the implications of this are for Scotland and the constitutional debate as we move forward. Great. So in terms of why the SNP, previous SES teams sought to explain why the SNP did so well, and their reasons were variations on what the wider literature says about why people vote the way they do. So obviously, in a Scottish context, we're looking at the national question, typically studied to see whether people who prioritized a Scottish identity were more likely to vote for the SNP, and that is in fact the case. But the SNP also benefits from the fact that it is existing within a world of multi-party politics, but where a binary question largely divides the electorate. So that yes-no issue on independence works to the advantage of the SNP, that is the only large party contesting constituency seats and supports independence, but you've got multiple pro-union parties on the other side. It's not quite that simple, because we know also that Brexit continues to exert an influence, and that's partly why we saw these different patterns in the results as the results came in. So in yes supporting Scotland, strong support for the SNP still holding up. In no supporting Scotland, if Leave was ahead, then we tended to see support behind the Conservatives, and if Remain was ahead, then we tended to see support swing behind the Labour Party. So Brexit complicates the constitutional issue, but independence still is really what's important. We also have leadership. So how popular is the leader? And certainly Nicola Sturgeon is still very popular. It's important to evaluate how her ratings compare to other leaders, and of course competence. Now, in terms of competence, what we knew from last time is that the Scottish twist on competence has been that standing up for Scotland is perceived to be the competence issue that really drives things, and it plays the same role as perceptions of economic competence play in other polities. But obviously 2020 and 2021 were very unusual years, and we're also interested to see how competence around COVID might have changed perceptions of things. So next slide, please. So first up, what I've done is I've gone to what voters said and how voters explained their own vote choices in their own words. So we had an open-ended question that just said, why did you vote the way that you did? And so the size of the words reflects the importance, or the number of people that gave that particular answer. And so what kind of hits you right between the eyes is the importance of independence, but also support for the SNP's policies. The word policies was used. It was very rare to have people actually specify which policies, and no election pledges actually made it onto, no specific election pledges actually made it onto anyone's list. The party is perceived to be best for Scotland, but you can also see references to Nicola Sturgeon herself and handling of coronavirus. And that handling of coronavirus is particularly important for Nicola Sturgeon, because more than half the time, people mentioned not just Nicola Sturgeon, but Nicola Sturgeon's performance in terms of handling the handling of coronavirus. If we also look at some of the negative reasons that people gave, not the Conservatives, not the Tories, dissatisfaction with Westminster. So who the SNP are not and who they offer an escape from is also part of the story here. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at constitutional preferences, this is just evidence that the SNP clearly benefits from that binary independence question. If you look at the two graphs on the bottom there, you see their performance among people who support yes, regardless of Brexit preference. And what we're seeing is that they capture 80% of those who are yes leavers. This is the list vote I'm talking about, and around 60% of yes remainers. That's because over 20% of those voters went to the Green Party. If you're looking at the top two graphs, one thing to watch out for, I think, is in terms of the no leavers. So there you see the Conservative Party is able to have a lock on those who share both of the Conservative Party's constitutional preferences on independence and on Brexit. But if you move over to the no remainers, once the largest tribe in Scotland, the Conservatives don't have the same dominant position. And in fact, it's Labour that's come out on top in this election, but often we see a straight four-way fight among no remainers, with the Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems and the SNP sometimes each each trying to battle for voters there. And what this, I think, underlines is the asymmetry in the situation. So it benefits the SNP, who is able to hold on to their yes voters regardless of Brexit preference, while the Conservatives are only able to hold on to no voters if they agree with their Brexit vote, and Brexit doesn't deliver any indie supporters to them. Next slide, please. In terms of leader ratings, what we have here is each row is how supporters feel about the different party leaders, and the symbols for the different party leaders are on the right there. I think there's two things worth noting here. If you look at the right-hand side of the graph, you can see the different symbols for the different party leaders, and that's basically showing us that each party prefers their own leader, which is not surprising. But what is surprising, or what is worth noting, is the extent to which the SNP holds Nicola Sturgeon in high regard. So SNP supporters give stronger ratings for Nicola Sturgeon than any other party gives for their own leader. She also polls poorly among Conservative voters, but she also polls above average for Green and Alba supporters. And the only other thing I would mention in this very quick presentation is if you look at the performance of Anna Sarwar is already outpolling the two other leaders of Willie Rennie. Next slide, please. Right, last slide from me. In terms of competence, one feature of 2016 was that the SNP outpolled every other party in terms of standing up for Scotland, which everyone expected, but it also outpolled every single party on every policy domain, even those policy domains where you might think that they were a little bit vulnerable because of external evidence we have about performance. So we have that same expanded list of policy domains for 2021. We also added in COVID, so we've got 10 different policy domains, and we've created an index there. If you look at the graph on the top right of the screen, we can look at how all voters rated the competence of the different parties. And what we see there is that the SNP is perceived to be more competent than the ratings given for Labour, who are again ahead of the ratings given for the Conservative Party. That's quite similar to 2016, with the exception that Labour has now popped into second place on economic competence instead of the Conservative Party. If you look at the party's own supporters, we see the order is slightly different. So the SNP hold their party in higher esteem than the Conservative Party, and the Labour Party holds than their voters hold their party. So SNP supporters feel that the SNP is more competent than Labour voters feel the Labour Party is competent, and same true for the Conservatives. And last thing to mention, if we break out two specific policy domains, if we look at standing up for Scotland and handling of COVID, we see that same pattern again. So SNP supporters far more convinced by the competence of their own party than are Labour and the Conservatives. And that gap is particularly large if we're looking at standing up for Scotland. So there's been a lot of talk about Labour's recovery in this election. They've got a popular leader. They're knocking the Conservatives off second place for economic competence. But I think these graphs show the limits there for Labour. Clearly, there's a certain amount of reserve or caution from their own supporters about the competence of their party. In terms of the SNP, 2021 has some twists on the old narrative caused by Brexit and by COVID, but from the point of view of just SNP support, it's very much more of the same. And I will leave it there.
Okay, thanks very much for having us, and thanks for giving me the vote switching thing, because Ailsa has already kind of made clear that it looked as if absolutely nothing happened. It was one of the most tedious elections on the surface in terms of the lack of changing of votes and seats, and the polls didn't tell a particularly different story. So you might think that this is not going to be one of the more eventful presentations, but actually it's worth querying that for two reasons. First, because of course these data can't really tell us what's happening under the surface. It's possible that nobody's changing, but it's also possible that lots of people are changing, but that those are cancelling out, and that's an important thing in itself. It tells us something about how entrenched the electorate is, and it tells us something about what the parties have the potential, at least, to gain. But it's also worth investigating because it would be a bit weird if nothing had happened, given that it was hardly an uneventful period between the last Scottish Parliament election in May 2016 and the one last month. There was Brexit, the endless aftermath of Brexit, a global pandemic, and the SNP being completely mired in sleaze of its particular variant in the last year or so. So it's worth checking, at least, to see what changed under the surface. Given that part of the entrenchment that we kind of expect is to do with the fact that IndieRef has polarised opinion so much, it's worth distinguishing two types of switching. So you're going to see three types of people appearing here. Those whose vote stayed the same, those who switched party but within their side of the yes-no divide, and then those who actually crossed that divide. And if we look between 2016 and 2021, on the constituency vote, 70%, but on the list vote, just 60% of people actually voted for the same party. So this is actually quite a bit of volatility. It's not that far out of line with what we generally see. And quite a bit of that switching was across the yes-no divide. And Ailsa has already hinted at what we think is the likeliest reason for that, which is Brexit stuff. Now, these graphs, they need longer than any of us have got to really internalise, so I'm just going to pick out a few shifts which we see as potentially Brexit inspired. And they're interesting shifts because they illustrate some of those asymmetries and contrasts. So, for example, we've got some Labour supporters going to the SNP, probably quite hardcore Remainers who are dissatisfied with Labour not being Remain enough. We've got some SNP supporters going to the Conservatives. That's because plenty of SNP supporters were Leavers, and some of them, most didn't, but some of them crossed to the Conservatives. And then you've got some Conservatives going to Labour, and they're often those no Remainers that Ailsa hinted at. And essentially, if you're a no Remainer, but it's more important to you to be no, you probably stick with the Conservatives, and you may even move to the Conservatives from Labour. But if you're a no Remainer for whom Remain is the important thing, then you're less likely to vote Conservative. Fraser will be fleshing this out with more evidence than I'm presenting here. But that's what it looks like. How about short-term switching? Here, the picture is very different. There's much less switching. Not that surprising, given the timescales. We're only really looking at people shifting in the last, the final weeks. And very, very little of that is across the yes-no divide. And this is kind of what we'd expect, given that it took a pretty seismic shock of Brexit to get anybody across that yes-no divide. We thought that that was just entrenched, polarised, nobody's switching, but then Brexit did make some people shift. But by the time that the campaign comes around, you know what the parties think about things, you know what you're doing. And so there's not much else to learn. And it reminded me of this quote from a leading source on recent general elections, the book that comes out after every election, which is summarising a kind of conventional wisdom that actually, for all the excitement of the campaign, when it's all over, things look pretty much as they did before. And that's because people have these fundamental perceptions about the parties, policies and leaders which have built up over the preceding years. And that's especially true in Scotland, where there are fundamental perceptions about these two huge constitutional issues. So there's very little to see here. And what there was still to learn, going back to this, what people learned was not where the parties stood on anything, but they just learned what the situation was on the ground, especially in their constituency, and they learned what the electoral system could do. So you see very little switching at the constituency level. What you did see, and this was very vivid on the night, where there would be a huge swing, for example, from the Lib Dems to the Conservatives in Aberdeenshire West, but a huge swing from the Conservatives to the Lib Dems in Fife North East, simply swinging to whichever candidate was best placed to defeat the SNP. And we can put more direct Scottish election study evidence on this with this question, which asked people why they voted the way they did. And what you see is, among those who switched during the campaign, this relatively small minority of voters, comfortably the most common reason for voting was to stop another party. And this was about learning how to stop another party. And the colour there is deliberately chosen because in fully 90% of those cases where a campaign switcher said, I voted to stop another party, it was the SNP. So we've got entrenchment on the big constitutional questions, but we don't have entrenchment in terms of parties. If there are multiple parties within a camp that suits people constitutionally, they're very happy to switch. We don't have to back down on the long-term story that people like me have been telling for decades about how party alignments are weakening. People are not in love with parties, but they are entrenched on the big issues. That's me done. Thanks very much.
Okay, so after all that chat about vote choice, we're going to be reflecting a wee bit on kind of what happens next. And to do that, we'll begin with where the voters were on the constitution right before the election. So our top line figures from the first wave for indirect vote intention, we showed the respondents the exact same question that was on the ballot in 2014. And when you exclude undecideds, this comes out at 48-52 in favour of no. And that's maybe slightly contrary to expectations after all the kind of convulsions of last year. In some polls you saw yes vote share going up past 50, as high as 55. It seems to have subsided, and we'll kind of see what the source of that is. So there's a small amount of change since 2014, but it seems like it's kind of settled back down. And I think there's a pretty good reason for that. This shows individual switching, and it tells a kind of similar story. So on the left, we have the people who voted in the 2014 referendum. And on the right, you have their preferences now. And basically what we see is a wash, almost slightly more transfers from no to yes, but it's very, very marginal. So the gains for yes haven't, since 2014, haven't come from mass switching on the part of no voters. And we can kind of dig into the reasons here. So this shows change in the yes share by Brexit vote. So the red circle is how each of these groups voted in 2014 in terms of the proportion voting yes. And the blue triangle is how they would vote now. And this is broken down by EU referendum vote. So you see that people who voted Remain in the EU referendum have become more pro-Indy, just slightly, a majority among them now would vote for independence. But perhaps contrary to expectations, we also observe similar movement among Leave voters. So people who voted Leave in 2016 have, in a sense, brought their own Scottish constitutional preference more in line with their EU preference, and they are much less likely to vote yes now. Of course, that group is a lot smaller in Scotland, but the movement among that group we find is actually quite a bit bigger, which partially explains why it's a wash. Now, the non-voters in 2016, we also see a similar jump to Remain, but obviously that's a much smaller group and includes some people who couldn't vote in 2014. So next slide. And this also shows the same phenomenon by age group. So what we kind of have is age patterns were just reinforced by the Brexit referendum. So older voters are now less likely to vote yes, and younger voters are now substantially more likely to vote yes than they were in 2014. Interestingly, we see this pattern again where the very youngest voters, the ones who couldn't necessarily vote in 2014, are actually slightly less in favour of independence. That's still a majority, but the under 22s, which are roughly where the cutoff is for those who couldn't vote in 2014, they're significantly less pro-independence than the age group immediately above them, so the kind of older Zoomers and millennials, which you could maybe describe as the kind of yes generation. They're the ones who were at school and in uni when it all kind of happened, and that possibly explains why they're much more in favour of independence. And returning to the constitutional tribes, so the combinations of independence and EU preference, we basically see that what used to be the biggest group, the No Remain, has been, I would say, decimated, but I think that refers to a 10% reduction. It's been much more destroyed than that. A good chunk of those voters have fled either in the direction of the Yes Remain camp or the No Leave camp. And the same goes for the Yes Leavers, who were already the smallest group. They're now something like 5% of the Scottish electorate. It's becoming a very niche opinion to believe in both Scottish independence and be against EU membership. But interestingly, you can see here, obviously on the left, we have the referendum votes, and on the right, we have the current preferences. That the transfers from the two tribes where the EU and independence preferences might be in some amount of conflict, those have been resolved roughly in similar ways. So the electorate is polarising much more around a pro-independence, pro-European bloc and an anti-independence, anti-European bloc, and that's why parties like Labour and the Lib Dems are going to continue getting squeezed. And immediately after the election, so obviously there was a lot of chat about whether the election result delivered a mandate for another independence referendum. Immediately afterwards, the respondents, we had about 55% saying that it did. So this bar graph shows it was a 4-point scale, so definitely did, probably didn't, definitely didn't. There's a majority overall say that an independence referendum mandate was achieved by the election result. If you click on one, we can also break this down by the current constitutional preference as well. And obviously this is quite polarized by people's yes or no preference. But we do see some no voters, roughly 25%, acknowledge that the result delivered a mandate for another referendum. And quite importantly, a healthy majority of undecided voters also believe it delivered the result for a referendum. So questions over its legitimacy of another referendum push. It was a bit more ambiguous in the pre-election wave, so we did ask about which scenarios would produce a mandate, and voters are very split on that. There was no kind of clear criteria, but it seems like that was resolved by the result, albeit only marginally. And this shows basically people's expectations about whether another independence referendum and Scottish independence itself are more or less likely as a result of the election. So this was a 5-point scale, and I've just turned it into a numeric one for the sake of easy comparison. And these are averages by yes, no, and undecided groups. Yes voters are very, very expectant. They basically believe that another referendum is much more likely, and that Scottish independence is much more likely as a result of this election. No voters are less pessimistic, perhaps, about the actual, independence itself. but they do think it made another independence referendum more likely. So, there, as much as some no commentators might be saying that, this result doesn't, change anything, the no voters clearly do think it has. And then undecideds, you find them kind of somewhere in between the other two groups. Looking forward, we asked respondents about whether they, when should another independence referendum take place. The plurality is obviously among the people who say never. So around 1/3 of people will never acknowledge that there should be another independence referendum. Around 10%, these are what you could call kind of impatient yes voters. They think that you should strike while the iron's hot and it should happen as soon as possible. And a further 20–25% think it should happen on the SNP's timescale, which is the next 2.5 years. This might cause a problem for the government if only about 1/3 of people are actually on board with their timescale. There's a majority for a referendum taking place in the next 5 years, but obviously it's going to be it'll be very heavily disputed whatever happens. This doesn't show a consensus at all, really. And to wrap up, there was a lot of discussion last year, especially about how the union was in great peril, that yes was inevitable, that Scotland was careening towards independence. And obviously, looking at what we've shown here, the demographic change and stuff is sorry, that was my phone. Demographic change is going to gradually change the landscape, but when we look at whether people feel they belong to either the yes or no side, the no side has a significant advantage. So they don't only have a numerical advantage in terms of the absolute number of voters who would currently vote no. They also are more entrenched in those positions. So around 1/4 of voters, just over 1/4 of voters, say they're very strongly no, versus just 20% who say they're very strongly yes. Only 20% say that they don't belong to either side, which obviously again suggests that we're very polarised on this as a country. Okay, so just to sum everything up, our top line constitutional preference is 48–52 in favour of no, with 11% undecided. And if you break them down, which we didn't show, they're roughly evenly split. Movement to yes observed in 2020 seems to have slowed or reversed. So if I was a yes voter, I wouldn't get overexcited. And I think the Scottish government are probably correct to try and temper expectations. We've seen roughly equal switching between yes and no since 2014 among people who voted in 2014, but the difference is mainly down to those who didn't or couldn't vote in either referendum. So yes has gained ground, but it's less to do with conversion happening more in one direction than the other, and more to do with demographic change. Brexit's also prompted sorting among the constitutional tribes, with voters basically more and more aligning their positions on independence and Brexit into either a pro-EU, pro-independence direction or an anti-EU, anti-independence one. I've probably overstated this a bit here. Most people think that at least the election made another referendum more likely, and a majority believe it should happen in the next few years, but very few are on board with SNP's timescale. It'll be interesting to see how that develops as the prospect of another referendum becomes more concrete. And we're also basically just extremely polarised. Most voters have a very clear preference in one direction or the other, but yes support is softer, and that possibly explains why we saw it kind of waxing and waning in the last year or so. It's more valence-based, whereas it seems like no voters are slightly more entrenched in their position. That's it from me.
Okay, thank you to Fraser, Rob and Ailsa. We're going to just bring up the Welsh presentation. While we do that, can I just remind you that there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, feel free to put them there and we will pick them up after we finish with this presentation. So we're going to start, and I should say that it's going to be me to start, then Jack is going to take over, and then Paula Surridge is going to come in with a killer stat towards the end. So let's start with the election in Wales. Quite interesting, the election results in Wales. There's quite an interesting contrast between the apparent lack of change at the aggregate level in Scotland and what happened in Wales. Because in Wales, we did see some pretty striking shifts in vote share. Both Labour and the Conservatives did well, but because of the collapse of the populists, UKIP got 7 seats. I mean, we've just ignored them completely in actually giving you the results. We've clearly written them out of history, although we will return to them in a bit. But basically, their complete collapse freed up seats on the list. So you've got this kind of strange election whereby the 3 main parties all increased their number of Senedd members at the end of the election. But clearly, in terms of vote share, both Labour and the Conservatives do well. The Conservatives ostensibly appear to do particularly well. And of course, there's a big net change of +5 seats there. But one of the things that we shall return to this in a moment, but I think it's worth spelling out at the moment, is that compared to the Conservatives' hopes pre-election, this probably was a slightly disappointing result, whatever is being said publicly, because after the Conservatives did so well in Wales in the 2019 UK general election, there was a great expectations within the Conservative Party were extremely high. The northeast of Wales has routinely been considered to be part of the red wall, which gets spoken about so much in the British media. The Conservatives put really substantial resources into campaigning. In Wales, we saw Boris Johnson visiting, Rishi Sunak visiting, and in the end, in terms of their straight fights with Labour, they managed to pick up the Vale of Clwyd seats, which was the kind of lowest of low-hanging fruits up in the northeast. But not only did Labour manage extremely well in terms of fighting off the Conservative challenge, they've actually pulled 2 Conservative-held constituencies down in the southwest of Wales into marginal territory. So that looks on the face of it like an extremely good result for the Conservatives. It is a very good result for the Conservatives, but remember what the expectations were. Then Plaid Cymru, basically stagnant, not going anywhere, and the Lib Dems dropping down even further from their already disastrous 2016 presentations. Now, I'm going to start with talking about Labour. The 15th of November 1922 should be a date which all political anoraks, not only in Wales, but across the UK, potentially across the world, should know about, because that is the date, obviously, of the 1922 general election, in which Wales first went for Labour. And since then, remarkably, for 99 years, Labour has won every UK general election in Wales, and of course has won every devolved election in Wales. So rather than show you a kind of standard Labour winning every election in Wales chat. What we decided to do was just show how Wales compares to other kind of sub-state contexts. And I should say that Jack and I are disputing whether we should include the Institutional Revolutionary Party of Mexico in this table at all. My line, it's not a proper liberal democracy for all of those 92 years. But anyway, the point is that just looking for anything like the extent of Labour domination in Wales, and you just don't find it, it is an absolutely extraordinary story. And what's very striking about this, and what I want to talk about in my part of the presentation, is that not only is Labour the dominant party, it's a dominant national party. And those two things, the national and the dominant, go together. So if we can just move to the next slide. In terms of the story of the election, one side of Labour's success is that they managed to do what the Labour Party in England conspicuously didn't manage to do, which is to bring back home, as Labour would put it, rather presumptuously, but after 100 years of domination, I guess you're allowed to be a bit presumptuous. What they managed to do was bring back Labour leavers who'd scattered to the Conservatives, or indeed to the Brexit Party in 2019. So this alluvial shows you those people who voted Labour in the 2016 devolved election and then voted Leave in the referendum on Brexit, which was held only a few weeks after the 2016 devolved elections. And you know what is remarkable, and I just would suggest that you look at there's a lot going on here, but look at 2019 to 2021 and look what happens to the Brexit support and the Conservative support, and look at the chunks of people who flow from the Conservatives and Brexit into Labour in the recent devolved election. You know, if Keir Starmer had managed the same thing in England, he would be feted, garlanded in red roses. Didn't happen in England, it happened in Wales. So that's one part of the story, is that Labour managed to confound the hopes of the Conservatives, and they managed to attract back former Labour Leave voters. The other side of the coin is that what Labour also managed to do in May was to a significant extent staunch the flow of people who vote for Labour in UK general elections and vote for Plaid Cymru in devolved elections. And we've seen since the dawn of democratic devolution a pattern whereby there's a group of voters who will vote for Labour in the UK election context, vote for Plaid in the devolved context. And the percentage varies. So what we've got here in this rather neat table is, you know, this is the proportion that switches. And obviously the first 1999 election where, as you will recall, Plaid Cymru outperformed the SNP and had that amazing success. That is a kind of an outlier. But in terms of the rest, in 21 is an election where Labour do rather well in terms of staunching that particular flow. Now, how do they manage this? If we can move to the next slide. Now, partly it's a matter of incumbency during the time of pandemic. And we know from lots of public attitudes data, and we've got more in the survey, which we won't repeat here because I think most people watching this will be aware of this. We know that the public in Wales tend to think that the Welsh Government has done a reasonable job especially compared to the UK government in England. The Welsh government has done a reasonable job in the context of the pandemic, and at least by implication, they're happy that things have been done differently in Wales. We also know from all kinds of opinion poll data that the profile of Mark Drakeford has been transformed by the pandemic. Mark Drakeford only became Labour leader in Wales in December 2018. He was, not very well known beyond political circles. His profile, his popularity have been transformed as a result of the pandemic. And of course, Labour's campaign focused very much on their pandemic record. There was very little in their manifesto, frankly, about the future. And they focused very much on Mark Drakeford. And what we have in this table is we asked people to use their own words to describe what they'd taken from Labour's campaign. And there are 3 words that stand out very sharply here: Mark, Drakeford, and Welsh. And I suspect that, and I'm sure they will be watching, so hello Labour staffers, I think this is a sign. I think you're going to be really happy seeing this, because I suspect these were the 3 words that you were kind of hoping that people would take from your campaign. The red dragon flags and Mark Drakeford focusing everywhere was a bit of a giveaway. And that is definitely what the voters took for the campaign. And that's, we can then move on. This really, the way that they stressed that Labour was doing what was right for Wales plays into what is historically its huge advantage in Wales, namely that it has been for a long time Wales's national party, drawing particular support in Wales from those who feel Welsh. And those of you in Scotland may be watching this going, well, duh, that's obvious. Wales is demographically a complicated place in terms of, it's much more heterogeneous in national identity terms than Scotland, for example. And Labour does well amongst those who feel Welsh. Now, this has been a staple of the literature on voting in Wales, with very few exceptions, since the serious study of elections in Wales began. Now, here's a really nice illustration of the point and illustrates patterns that people in Wales will be really familiar, or people who are interested in Welsh politics will be really familiar with. This is aggregate level data. It shows you the proportion, the kind of constituency vote share of the Conservatives and Labour, and then what we've got is the proportion of the population of the constituency born in Wales. And you see a really quite nice relationship there. That was published immediately after the election, but this is the individual level data, which makes the point even more starkly. Now here we're using the Relative Territorial Identity Index, or the Henderson Index, as I like to call it, which tries to look at, for our money, a better way than the Moreno scale of looking at the relationships between different senses of national identity. So what we've got is people who feel strongly British and not at all Welsh, people who feel equally strongly British and Welsh, or people who feel strongly Welsh and not British at all. And what we've got here is Labour, Welsh Conservatives, and Plaid. There's a lot going on here. So what I draw your attention to is, first of all, right on the left-hand side, compare the Conservatives and Labour. Now, the Conservatives do considerably better than Labour amongst those in Wales with no sense of Welsh identity, but the Tories do horribly amongst those who feel Welsh, not British. Indeed, it's striking the extent to which Plaid and the Conservatives are basically mirror images of each other. Obviously, then compare those with Labour. Labour overall perform better amongst those with strong or exclusive Welsh identity. But the gradient is shallower, which is a sign of strength. So Labour is a national party in Wales in two senses. It does well amongst those who feel Welsh, but it's the only party that does reasonably well amongst everybody. So it's a kind of catch-all party in that sense. And then for the Conservatives and Plaid, the steepness of these identity gradients are a challenge, really. That, you know, it's a real problem for the two of them, and neither party has found a way of successfully addressing that. And with that, I hand over to Jack.
Great, diolch, Richard. I'm going to whiz through some charts looking at Conservatives in Wales and their performance, and also Plaid Cymru before handing over to Paula. So some of what we've said will already give you some hints of kind of where we're going with this. So first, looking at the Conservatives. Right, here we go. So as Rich has already pointed out in the introduction, the Conservatives did really well in the 2019 general election in Wales. They got their best ever results in terms of vote share, and they matched their, in terms of proportion of seats, they matched their best ever result in Wales. So they did, you know, very well. 2021 Senedd election was a bit of a strange election for them because, yes, it was actually, in terms of vote share and seat share, their best ever result at a devolved election. But as Richard's already pointed out, they might be slightly disappointed that they didn't really make more gains, especially in the corner of the northeast there. So here what we're looking at is, where did people who voted Conservative in 2019, how did they vote in 2021? This is looking, by the way, at the constituency vote. And here we see kind of the Conservatives' big problem when we're going from general elections to devolved elections. So while they managed to kind of keep almost half, basically, of their voters, they have a big chunk, just over a fifth, abstains. They don't turn out to vote. And this has always been a problem for the Conservatives at devolved elections in Wales. They've always struggled to get the vote out, get their core vote out. The other thing we see here, though, that is slightly unique at this election from what we've seen, is this 11% who ended up voting Labour. And the next slide puts this, I think, in quite nice context. So here we're looking at just people who vote in both devolved elections and Westminster elections. So we've got rid of people who don't vote in either one. Here we're looking at switches between Conservative to Labour. Right, so these are people who vote Conservative in the general election that immediately precedes a devolved election. And in 2021, we see that basically Conservative to Labour switching was higher than it's ever been before, by a considerable margin as well. This is also shown, I think, nicely in the alluvial that Richard showed earlier with Labour voters. I think there's kind of two reasons for why this might be the case, or we think this is the case. The first is that just because in 2019 the Conservatives did so well, there's far more Conservatives to switch, right? So that's part of it. But we also think there's kind of a double kind of pronged approach or reason for this switching as well. The first is that in 2019, it seems as though there was quite a lot of people kind of lending their vote for the Conservatives for the reason of Brexit. People who wouldn't normally vote Conservatives, but in 2019 they thought, okay, you know, Brexit needs to get done, particularly strong among people who voted Leave. But as we saw in that alluvial that Richard showed earlier, a lot of that group then went back to Labour at this election. The other thing is that COVID obviously has been, you know, obviously changed the kind of political landscape everywhere. And in generally, we can see that across the board, people think that Welsh Labour and Mark Drakeford have done a good job. And this also contributes to that higher flow of kind of Conservative general election voters going to Labour at the Senedd election. We asked people kind of in their own words, why did you switch the party you voted for? Okay. And I felt like this quote sums it up almost perfectly. So this is a cherry-picked quote, but I think it sums up kind of our thinking in quite nicely. So someone who said that, you know, they voted Conservative in the general election because of Brexit. In the Senedd election, I voted Labour because I thought he, assuming that means Mark Drakeford, did a better job at handling Corona here. So again, we think that kind of builds into the reason why the Conservatives didn't do quite as well as they might have hoped, although later on we'll show how they were able to make some gains as well. Going next to Plaid Cymru. So just like the word cloud we showed earlier, this is a word cloud asking people, again, what they kind of took away from the Plaid Cymru campaign. A few things to notice here. So obviously Adam Price stands out, but you know, far fewer people mention the leader of Plaid Cymru than people mention the leader of Welsh Labour, Mark Drakeford. But the thing that obviously really stands out here is independence. So Plaid, synonymous with independence, even though really they've only been kind of out as really pushing it as a policy objective in the last few years, really. But whether they're talking about it or not, basically, people think, okay, Plaid Cymru, they're the party that wants an independent Wales. Their problem, though, is that among the group of supporters, which is around a third of people in Wales who are in favour of independence, Plaid Cymru aren't really winning a large majority of these voters. In fact, Labour are doing a really good job of sweeping up a lot of this support. One of the things that we've seen, which has been really noticeable in opinion polls and the election study data, is that the growth of people who support independence in Wales, which has happened over the last few years, this hasn't led to people then moving to support Plaid Cymru, as we say it might do in Scotland. People who support independence naturally would move towards the SNP there. In Wales, a lot of this growth has happened within Welsh Labour. So it's actually Welsh Labour supporters which are driving increases in support for independence. Somewhere between 40 and 50% of Welsh Labour supporters now favour independence. So this is a real problem for Plaid, given that their reason for existing in some ways, at least, is advocating for an independent Wales, but they're not really winning this group over. But this also kind of maybe suggests that there's some room for manoeuvre. There's room for Plaid to make gains in this group here. The other thing that we've looked at is language ability and constituency vote choice. So, like Richard said, like national identity has always been a very important part of analysing voting in Wales, so has language ability. Obviously, those who are interested in Welsh politics will know that Plaid Cymru support has always been highly correlated with the ability to speak Welsh, in particular fluent Welsh. So here we've plotted basically constituency vote in 2016 by language ability, and the same in 2021. And there's a couple of things to pick up on. You might not see it immediately, but on closer inspection, I think it's quite important. So first, the growth in that yes fluently group, so people who fluent everyday Welsh speakers, the growth in that group that Plaid Cymru have really grown into. So their vote share increased in that group by about 8 points, which is quite considerable. However, they lost votes among that group, the group who don't speak any Welsh at all. So that no group there. So those are people who have no knowledge of Welsh, or they say they have no knowledge of Welsh, but they're losing votes there, Plaid Cymru. As you can see, this kind of changes everywhere else, but what the takeaway we think here is that support for Plaid retreated back into its kind of its heartland, and they're becoming more dependent on the language as a source for support at this election, which again is one of the reasons why they didn't do particularly well at this election. Yes, they picked up a seat. Their vote share held pretty much exactly the same as it was previously, but really realistically at Senedd elections, Plaid will always be looking at making significant and substantial gains. And I think next, oh yes, of course. So next we're going to look at Ukip voters. So as we've already discussed, in 2016 Ukip won 7 seats in the Senedd and won substantial chunk of the popular vote as well. So this is looking at 2016 Ukip list voters and how did they vote in 2021. And so while the Conservatives may have lost some votes to kind of people who didn't turn out to vote, and also to Labour, they picked up a plurality by a big way of people who voted Ukip last time on the list. And this explains why they were able to make some gains, in particular in vote share and on the list in particular, where they did particularly well. Abolish also picked up a fair chunk of this support, as well as then, again, a substantial chunk didn't turn out to vote. There is some splitting among that kind of more than those more populist right parties, so Abolish, Reform and Ukip. But to be honest, even if all of that vote share was consolidated into one party, it's very unlikely that they would have won a substantial number of seats, maybe just one or two, but nothing like how Ukip did last time. Now, this final slide, because obviously a lot of the Scotland presentation was about the Constitution, and while obviously the Constitution is more important to voting in Scotland, we couldn't let them get away with having kind of all that fun. So here what we've done is plot changes in constitutional preference among different national identity groups in Wales. So at the one end of the spectrum, we have people who want to abolish the Senedd. At the other end of the spectrum, we have people who favour independence, who want independence. And the change here, so the direction of the arrow is plotting change from 2016, so the mean placement of this group in 2016 to 2021. And we were quite surprised, but pretty much across the board, except among British and Welsh and English only, which is British and Welsh a substantial group in Wales. But among every other group has become at least more Devo friendly, if not in favour of independence in particular. But there's some really big and substantial movements there that we see. So generally, we might see that devolution is becoming even more settled as the will of people in Wales. This, by the way, is taken from a Discover Society piece, which has actually just been published today. So we'll make sure we tweet the full piece later on. And next, I'm going to hand over to Paula.
Thanks, Jack. I've just got the one slide to talk through here because I was in a Wi-Fi black spot all weekend. So although everybody else had the data from Friday, I didn't see it till yesterday. And I wanted to dig under the surface a little bit of the identities that people in Wales hold. So there's two pieces of data on the chart. The black diamonds indicate the relative size of the groups, and then the red bars indicate how much of the vote share in that group Labour won. I probably should have added Conservatives on here as well, because there's some interesting differences there, but trying to keep things as simple as possible. This comes from a question where people are given a long list of different potential identities that they could hold and asked to choose the top three. So some things just to bring out from that distribution of identity groups. Firstly, political identities in the narrow sense don't score very highly. So when asked to choose from this long list of identity groups, fewer than 10% choose Leaver, around 10% choose Remainer, a tiny fraction choose their political party or Welsh independence. So those very narrowly defined identities are not particularly popular. The most popular identity by 1 percentage point is parent, and immediately behind that we've got Welsh. So we've got this combination of the popular identities being people's personal identities and their national identity. And then you can look across those bars then to see where Labour support is strongest. And it reiterates the point from the earlier slides, particularly I think from the word cloud, that where people feel Welsh, which is one of the largest groups, the Labour Party do particularly well, getting 40% share of the vote overall. They also do well amongst the smaller group that say they feel working class, but again the larger group that say they're a parent. and they get about 54% of those who say they're Remainers. Now, that's not the same as those who voted Remain in the referendum. That's a different kind of question. So I think what we see here is, from a different perspective, the same kinds of patterns that we saw at the aggregate level and that we saw using the national identity measures on their own. That there is this connection with Welshness, if that's a word, and Welsh identity, and the Labour Party, which Labour elsewhere in the UK has been unable to connect with national identities in that way. But also, I think this chart demonstrates to us the relative salience of different identities to people. So in some senses, people's personal identities are much more important to them than their political identities. And that might also be a lesson for some of the parties in terms of how they connect with voters, that trying to connect through different kinds of identities might be more fruitful than trying to connect through the narrow political identities, which don't seem to have a great deal of resonance. And I'll leave it there because we've gone quite a long way over the time already.
Yeah, thank you, and apologies for the terrible chairing that has meant that we've eaten up a lot of time. So if everybody, in terms of the presenters, can come back on, let me just remind you that we've got 20 minutes. We will stop promptly at 10:30. We've got some questions, and I'm just going to dip into the Q&A box down below. Please write any questions down there, and I'll just ask questions. We've got a question about turnout, which actually, I think, from James Morrison. Thank you, James. It's good that you've raised this because neither presentation spoke about this, so it's good to have the opportunity. Turnout in Scotland was much higher this time than in 2016. Why did they vote this time? Are they any different from regular voters? Is the question from James. Ailsa, I'm going to hand over to you, but if you want to hand it off to anybody else, please do that.
Well, I haven't even looked at the turnout data. I mean, one thing I would say is that the online data, election studies that we gather purely through online methods are typically terrible for helping us to truly understand what's going on with turnout, because we've got people false reporting that they vote, but that's actually not the issue. We've got an over-representation of active people. The kind of people who are likely to vote are also the kind of people who are likely to say, why, yes, I will fill in your survey. So all of the data should be treated with caution. I haven't looked at it, my colleagues might have, but our working hypothesis was that it was partly to do with the extension of the franchise. So extending it to a certain group of voters might well mean that group that was first allowed to vote in this election would have higher turnout than the general population. We know that there was at least a 10-point jump in terms of the proportion requesting postal ballots. So we imagine that ease of voting is also partly what's going on. And we know that in tight elections, turnout is likely to be higher. This was not a tight election, but if you look at whether we knew who was going to win, but it was a tight election if we look at whether the issue that mattered was whether they got that majority or not. And it was tight on that. And so those are the working hypotheses those and others will be using when we turn to the data. But I don't know if any of my colleagues have actually looked at any of that and want to jump in.
I would just add that if we look at the kind of underlying factors like interest and expectation that elections will make a difference, we see very little change, not enough to explain the big jump in turnout. So my kind of chief suspect would be changes in the kind of institutional environment due to the ease of postal voting pending that more serious data analysis.
I can actually throw this over to Jack as well. There's an anonymous attendee who has asked the question, which is somewhat related. So it's about those people who vote in the UK general elections but don't vote in devolved elections. Do we know anything about that group? And in particular, obviously, its relevance in terms of the Conservative Party. Jack, I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
Sure. So overwhelmingly, they tend to be Conservative supporters who live in constituencies that the Conservatives have no chance of winning. There's a really steep line between kind of the marginality of a constituency and turnout in Wales. So in places, for example, like Merthyr is a good example, right, where Labour, I actually can't remember what the Labour majority was, but massive majority. Also had, I think, lowest turnout in Wales. And that's generally the same everywhere. I think it's different because at a UK general election, the framing is different, because even though Conservative supporters, okay, you might not win in Merthyr, but there's still this idea that you're turning out to vote for a party that can win and form a government. Whereas at the Senedd election, even though, like we said, the Conservatives made good gains, they had a really good result for them, made good results in the last few elections in Wales, there's still not really a likely prospect of Conservatives forming a government. So I think that there's a lot of people who just think, oh, well, why bother? And then there are still a small but kind of significant number of people in Wales who just hate everything about devolution and refuse to engage with it at all.
Thanks, Jack. I should say that both Scottish and the Welsh surveys have done quite a lot on the 16 and 17-year-olds, and of course in Wales the franchise was extended to that group in Wales, and so I think we've got about 250 in our sample, but we haven't had time to do much for that yet. But we will be saying more about the impact, if any, of the extension of the franchise, and we can do some comparison with Scotland, where obviously there's a bit more history to this. I've got a question here for Paula, which another anonymous attendee, or maybe the same one, asked this question, saying it's maybe slightly irrelevant, but I think it's interesting. So it's interesting that when asked about identity, people didn't seem to refer to their ethnic background and sexuality. There's some mention significantly less than parent or spouse, partner, for example. Seems surprising. Do you have any idea why?
Just a small question then.
Yeah, just a tiny little one.
Don't need the whole of social psychology to go at that one. I think it's a measure of kind of relative salience for people rather than absolute. So it's not suggesting that people don't identify with groups defined by those concepts. It's just that when you ask them what's most important to them, other things are more important. We'll need to dig in further to find out which groups actually say which identities. I haven't had time to do that yet. But we do also see in other work that people who belong to the much larger majority group in some of those identity groups are much less likely to choose it as a source of identity, and that might be driving some of those figures as well.
Thank you, and thanks for answering a big question concisely, something I never manage. Question from Nicola McEwen. Bore da, Nicola. Did you ask the Standing Up for Wales question? Would be interesting to see comparisons between Welsh and Scottish Labour. Also, beyond COVID governance, did Welsh Labour benefit electorally from assertive defence of self-government and the stance it's taken during the Brexit process? Jack, do you want to have a first go at that?
Yes, so we did ask it, although I haven't looked at it yet. Apologies. I promise I will soon. In terms of the assertive self-government governance, I think so, yeah. Because one of the things we did see is that it's quite strange is that Mark Drakeford is phenomenally popular among Plaid Cymru supporters, almost as popular as among Labour supporters. Plaid Cymru supporters really like Mark Drakeford, and that is something that we haven't seen with previous First Ministers or Welsh Labour leaders. And if I don't know this for certain, but if I had to guess, I would think that a lot of that is to do with the way he's talked about, or in Wales we do things different, and that's been a big line he's used. We have a different approach here in Wales, and Plaid Cymru supporters, they quite like that, So yes, I think so.
Yeah, I just just come in on the back of this. I mean, since that first devolved election where Labour got that terrible fright, they've absolutely made sure that there's no space for plaid. And, you know, it was very striking if you watched the parliamentary broadcast that Welsh Labour put out. It was all red dragon flags and soft rolling green hills. And I can't remember if there was a choir singing in the background, but they talk about Welsh values and how Welsh values are different. And, you know, it is absolutely not so soft nationalism. And the care that has been taken not to alienate independent supporting Labour voters is very, very striking. So the mood music is all, you know, people are being pushed into supporting independence by the unacceptable behaviour of the Conservative Party, you know, open brackets, and we understand, we sympathise, and, you know, and if you need to start listening to us, or you're just going to push these people even further along. We should do more on the difference between Scottish and Welsh Labour, because it really is remarkable how differently they've handled the constitutional question and the identity question and the language they use and the framing that they use. I've got a question for Fraser, if he's there. Fraser, I'm not sure if you're there. Your last point, is Fraser there? Because there's no point, well, somebody else may be able to answer it. Your last point on soft yeses and the importance of valence. Have you had a chance yet to explore this in the data beyond demographics? What drives voters to or from supporting independence? Performance of government, First Minister, views of SNP, or issues around consequences, costs of independence? That's another question from Nicola. Sorry, I didn't see that was from you, Nicola, but you've had two questions. So if Fraser is there, or if Rob or Ailsa can answer. Doesn't look as if Fraser is there.
I'm happy to say.
Thank you, Rob.
I mean, my short bit about that will be really that there's not much to talk about. As in, one of Fraser's key data analyses revealed that actually there's relatively little individual level change in support for independence. The aggregate change is driven more by replacement of no supporters with yes supporters in the electorate. There has been some change though, but it seems to be driven much. I mean, there was very little change. Then there was Brexit. Then there was the argument about the power grab subsequent to Brexit. And those big things shifted a few people, but there's very little evidence of much kind of short-term, like any short-term change in the polls is probably more margin of error than it is a kind of valence or other driven support for independence. I mean, there obviously is a very small group of people who are wavering, but we struggle to find a kind of deep dynamic that we can explain with those kind of variables like First Minister performance or things like that.
The only thing I would add to that very comprehensive answer is that if you look at the very small proportion of people who have moved from no to yes, and you look at the people that were no voters, then remain voters and are now yes voters, that movement helps to explain some of the broader trends we're seeing, because women and younger people are overrepresented within that group. So the general trend answer is absolutely correct. If you look at what's happening within those people who have switched and have switched because of Brexit, then that also helps us to understand some of the changes that are happening and explains why we're seeing people who don't know coming off the fence, but also new entrants to the electorate backing yes. That also explains why we've seen not just a narrowing of the gender gap, but in some polls a reversal of the gender gap, with women now more supportive than men.
Great. I've got a question here from Peter McCall. Thank you, Peter. And this actually, given that this is another big question, and I expect most of the panel will have something to say about it. Maybe this will be our last question. If it is, I apologise to everybody else. The question is the best way to understand this election result across Scotland, Wales and England, and yes, absolutely, the fact that we also had elections in England gives another interesting point of comparison, that there was a rally to the flag effect that buttressed the existing national projects of the otherwise very different ruling parties in each polity. So rally to the flag in the context of the pandemic, potentially, or whatever else is going on. Don't know, Rob, Ailsa, who wants to have a first go at this? Ailsa?
I think it's, well, this is my 2 cents. I think it's, I don't think it's a rallying round the flag effect. I think it's a pre-existing effect. We would have seen much the same results had the election taken place a year and a bit earlier. What you're seeing is the party that is perceived to be best able to stand up for that particular part of the country doing best in each of those electorates. I think it's a further confirmation of the extent to which we have 4 completely different electorates in the UK, and in the context of Britain, I think it's parties that are perceived to be best able to stand up for their particular bit. So it's nationalism operating in each of these different locations. I think coronavirus comes after that. I don't think it's fundamentally changed the direction of things.
Can I jump in there as well? So I agree with everything else is said, and actually I should some work I've done with James Griffiths at the University of Manchester, we kind of show that these national identities, that's the lens through which a lot of corona stuff is actually viewed anyway. But I would also say that I think it's quite odd that it's become like the explanation that, oh, well, the different results are explained by incumbency this time has become sort of a narrative. Because actually for the last, 4 elections now, different parties have won. Different parties have always won in different parts of the UK. This isn't a new thing. This hasn't happened this time. 2019, 2017, 2015, different parties won in each part of the UK then. And that isn't often, that wasn't explained by, oh, it's just an incumbency effect. So I think there is something different, like Ailsa said, basically.
Paula, Rob, either of you want to come in? Paula?
I'll just add something of the English comparison, I suppose, to add another dimension to it. I think it goes back to what Ailsa was saying during her presentation about standing up for, and then whatever comes after that for is quite important. So in Scotland, it's Scotland, in Wales, it's Wales, but then in England, it might be different things in different parts of England. And I think potentially what we saw was that same effect happening in the Northeast and the Northwest with their respective mayors. So it's the same kind of process, but not necessarily linked to nationalism or even regionalism necessarily as an identity, but a sense that somebody is speaking up for that group of people. And I know in the Northeast, you're talking about a Conservative mayor standing up to the Conservatives, but there is still a sense of that group of Northeastern mayor and MPs asking the Conservatives to do something differently in that region. So I think that broader sense of standing up for is really important. And then coronavirus layers on top of that, because it makes those differences between areas and approaches much, much more visible. But I don't think it's necessarily the cause so much as amplifying what was already there.
Thanks, Paula. Rob, did you have a final word on that one?
I mean, I agree with everything said so far. And the only thing I would add is that we always have this problem when we have a tendency to think about parties' trajectories as this kind of smooth thing. And then when the type of election changes, so for example, the SNP did very badly in 2017 in the general election, but that had relatively little to do with Scottish politics and much more to do with other things. And then, so then they seemed to be kind of on an upturn. And then by 2021, a real upturn, but it was more to do with the fact this was a different type of election. And I agree very much with what Ailsa said, that you could have had this Scottish election at any time, basically since about mid-2018, and the result would have been virtually identical.
Okay, thanks. And I just I'm going to just say one very quick thing. I mentioned the 15th of November, 1922, which is obviously a date that you will have written on your hats forever after this morning's session. I mean, the interesting position that Welsh Labour finds itself in as the dominant national party in Wales. The Conservatives dominate 85% of the states, so they're okay. The SNP, they have a a project which involves exits. Now, obviously, there are major issues which have been highlighted today about whether that is going to be possible or not. But the problem that Welsh Labour have is, what is their strategy if Labour is not coming back anytime soon in England, is not coming back anytime soon in Scotland? And, you know, breaking news, folks, I think it might be tough for them. So what does Labour, as Wales's dominant party, do when it's got, you know, nobody wants to listen to it in London, and indeed we have a London government that is intent on undermining devolved powers, and there's nothing that the Welsh government can do about it. So there's you know, as you know, the most impressive electoral force in these islands sails serenely on, there's a big reef ahead of them which they're going to have to negotiate. Okay, I think I did say we finished promptly. I'm sorry, there are lots of interesting questions still in the question and answer box. As I said at the start, this is just the first go at this. We're going to be doing much, much more over coming months and indeed years. Thank you so much for your interest, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you to everybody. Diolch yn fawr.